see them. Hands where I can see them.
Officer, calm down. I'm FBI.
That's what they all say. On your knees.
Listen to me. I'm a federal agent.
I'm done listening. Get down now.
You're about to end your whole department.
Is that a threat?
The body camera footage would become the most damaging evidence in one of the largest federal investigations into police corruption in Ohio history. What Officer Kevin Mercer didn't understand as he forced a black man to his knees on a quiet suburban street was that he had just handcuffed a 12-year FBI veteran, a man who specialized in investigating police misconduct, a man whose phone call that evening would trigger an operation that would dismantle Mercer's entire department within 18 months. It was 10:52 on a Friday morning in late June, the kind of summer day where sprinklers hissed on manicured lawns and neighbors waved from their driveways. Oakwood Hills was one of those suburbs that pride themselves on being safe, quiet, and exclusive. The kind of place where nothing ever happened. The kind of place where a black man driving a nice car through a nice neighborhood attracted attention he never asked for. Darnell Crawford had just finished his morning run. He was wearing a gray polo shirt, athletic shorts, and sneakers. His Dodge Charger was parked in front of his own house, the house he had purchased 3 years earlier, the house where his wife and 2 daughters were inside eating breakfast. He had stepped outside to grab his gym bag from the back seat when he noticed a police cruiser slow down at the end of his street. He knew immediately what was about to happen. After 12 years with the FBI, after investigating dozens of cases involving racial profiling, he recognized the signs, the way the cruiser lingered, the way it turned around and came back, the way it pulled up behind his car, even though he was parked legally in front of his own home. He had seen this movie before. He had just never expected to be the star of it. Before we continue, where are you watching from? Drop your location in the comments. And if you're new here, hit subscribe. What this officer did to his own department is something you need to see. Darnell Crawford was not just any FBI agent. He was a supervisory special agent with the Bureau's Civil Rights Division, based out of the Cleveland field office. His specialty was investigating law enforcement corruption and civil rights violations by police departments. He had led investigations that resulted in the federal takeover of 3 different police departments. He had personally testified in cases that sent 23 police officers to prison. He had been featured in FBI training videos about recognizing systemic misconduct. In other words, Officer Kevin Mercer had just picked the worst possible person in the entire state of Ohio to racially profile. But Mercer didn't know any of that. All Mercer saw was a black man in an expensive car in a neighborhood where, in his mind, black men didn't belong. Mercer stepped out of his cruiser with his hand already resting on his weapon. His body camera captured everything that followed, though he seemed to have forgotten it was recording. That footage would later be played in federal court, in FBI training sessions, and on news programs across the country. His first question was not a greeting. It was an accusation. He asked Darnell what he was doing there. Darnell turned slowly, keeping his hands visible, exactly as he had trained countless citizens to do when confronted by hostile officers. He explained calmly that he lived there. He pointed at the house directly behind him. He said his wife and daughters were inside having breakfast right now. Mercer did not look at the house. He did not acknowledge the explanation. Instead, he asked whose car it was. Darnell said it was his car, registered in his name, parked in front of his own house. Mercer asked if he could prove that. Now, here's what's important to understand. Darnell was standing on his own property. He had committed no crime. He was not suspected of any crime. There was no legal requirement for him to prove anything to anyone. But Darnell also understood the reality of being a black man confronted by a police officer who had already decided he was a threat. He told Mercer that his wallet was inside the house. He offered to go get it. He offered to have his wife bring it out. He offered every reasonable accommodation a person could offer. Mercer refused all of them. Instead, he told Darnell to put his hands on the vehicle. Darnell did not comply. Not out of defiance, but because he knew his rights, and he knew that complying with an unlawful order would only enable further abuse. He stated clearly and calmly that he was a federal agent. He stated that his FBI credentials were inside his house. He stated that if Mercer would simply allow him to retrieve them, this entire situation could be resolved in 30 seconds. Mercer's response would later be played in federal court as evidence of his state of mind. He laughed. He actually laughed. Then he said that everyone claims to be someone important when they get caught. He said he'd heard every excuse in the book. He told Darnell to stop lying and put his hands on the car. Type karma in the comments if you can already see where this is going. Darnell made one more attempt. He spoke slowly and clearly, enunciating every word so there would be no confusion on the recording. He stated his full name. He stated that he was a supervisory special agent with the Federal Bureau of Investigation. He stated that he had been with the Bureau for 12 years. He stated that he was asking one law enforcement officer to another for professional courtesy. Mercer did not care. He grabbed Darnell's arm and spun him around. He kicked Darnell's feet apart. He shoved him against the side of his own car with enough force to leave a dent that would later be photographed as evidence. He wrenched Darnell's arms behind his back and applied handcuffs so tightly they left bruises visible for a week. A neighbor across the street, a retired white woman named Patricia Holloway, had been watering her flowers when she heard the commotion. She looked up to see her neighbor, a man she had known for 3 years, a man who had helped her carry groceries, a man whose daughters played with her grandchildren, being handcuffed by a police officer in front of his own home. She started recording on her phone. That video would later corroborate everything the body camera captured. She shouted across the street that the officer was making a mistake. She said that man lived there. She said his family was inside. Mercer told her to mind her own business and go back in her house. Patricia did not go back in her house. She kept recording. Darnell's wife, Michelle, had heard the shouting through the open kitchen window. She ran outside to find her husband in handcuffs, pressed against his own car, in front of their own home. Their 2 daughters, ages 7 and 10, followed her onto the porch and immediately started crying. Michelle demanded to know what was happening. Mercer told her to stay back. She identified herself as the homeowner and demanded again to know why her husband was being detained. Mercer told her that if she didn't back up, she would be arrested too. Michelle Crawford was a corporate attorney. She knew the law, she knew her rights, and she knew exactly how to handle this situation. She told her daughters to go inside and stay there. Then she pulled out her own phone and started recording from a second angle. She stated clearly, for the recording, their address. She stated that they owned this home. She stated that her husband was a federal agent and that his credentials were inside. She demanded Mercer's name and badge number. Mercer ignored her. He was too busy searching Darnell, patting him down aggressively, asking if he had any weapons or drugs. Darnell, still perfectly calm despite everything, stated that, yes, he had a weapon because he was a federal law enforcement officer. He stated that his service weapon was locked in a safe inside the house. He stated again that his FBI credentials could be produced immediately if Mercer would simply allow it. Mercer found nothing on Darnell, no weapons, no drugs, nothing illegal of any kind. Just a man in workout clothes standing in front of his own home. A reasonable officer would have paused. A reasonable officer would have considered the possibility that he had made a mistake. A reasonable officer would have allowed the man to produce the identification that would have ended this entire encounter. Kevin Mercer was not a reasonable officer. He called for backup. When he did, he told dispatch he had detained a suspicious individual who was refusing to cooperate and claiming to be a federal agent. The body camera audio captured every word of this lie. Darnell had been cooperating completely. He had offered to provide identification multiple times. Mercer had refused every offer. Quick question for everyone watching. Have you ever been accused of something you didn't do? Type yes in the comments if you have. Backup arrived within 4 minutes. 2 additional officers from the Oakwood Hills Police Department pulled up with lights flashing. By now, 3 other neighbors had come outside to see what was happening. All of them knew Darnell. All of them were confused and alarmed. 2 more phones were recording. The backup officers, named Hernandez and Walsh, approached the scene. Mercer briefed them, saying he had a suspicious individual who claimed to live here and claimed to be FBI. The way he said claimed made clear he didn't believe either statement. Officer Hernandez looked at the scene. He saw a man in handcuffs. He saw a woman in professional attire recording on her phone. He saw 2 children crying in a doorway. He saw neighbors gathered on lawns, several recording. Something about this picture didn't match what Mercer was describing. He asked Mercer if he had verified anything. Mercer said the suspect was being uncooperative. Hernandez looked at Michelle and asked if she could prove they lived there. Michelle said the deed, utility bills, and her husband's FBI credentials were all inside the house. She asked if she could please go get them. Hernandez told her yes. Mercer objected. He said the scene wasn't secure. He said they couldn't let anyone in or out until they determined what was going on. Hernandez ignored him. Michelle went inside. She returned 45 seconds later with a folder. Inside was the deed to the house with both their names on it, a recent utility bill, and Darnell's FBI credential case, complete with his badge and official identification card. She handed everything to Officer Hernandez. He looked at the documents. He looked at the FBI credentials. He looked at Darnell, still in handcuffs, still pressed against his own car. He looked at Mercer. The silence lasted about 5 seconds. It felt like an hour. Hernandez told Mercer to remove the handcuffs immediately. His voice was flat, professional, but underneath it was something else, the recognition of a disaster unfolding. Mercer hesitated. Even now, faced with irrefutable proof that he had assaulted and falsely detained a federal agent on his own property, he couldn't bring himself to admit he was wrong. He muttered something about the situation looking suspicious, about the car matching a description. There was no description. There had been no report. It was a lie, and everyone present knew it. Hernandez repeated himself. Remove the handcuffs. Now. Mercer finally complied. The cuffs came off. Darnell straightened up, rubbing his wrists where the metal had dug into his skin. His polo shirt was stretched and dirty from being pressed against the car. His wrists were red and starting to bruise. His daughters were still crying on the porch. Do you think Mercer understood in that moment that his career was over? Let me know in the comments. Darnell turned to face Mercer directly. His voice was calm, controlled. The voice of a man who had conducted hundreds of interrogations and knew exactly how to manage his emotions. Under pressure, he asked for Mercer's badge number. He asked for his full name. He asked for the names and badge numbers of the other officers present. He stated that he would be filing a formal complaint with the Oakwood Hills Police Department, with the Ohio Attorney General's office, and with his colleagues at the FBI. Then he said something that would prove to be prophetic. He told Officer Mercer that he had just made the biggest mistake of his life. He said that he had spent his entire career investigating police departments, exactly like this one. He said that this encounter told him everything he needed to know about how this department operated, and he said that by the time the FBI was finished, this department would no longer exist. Mercer had no response. He just stood there, his face slowly draining of color as the reality of what he had done began to sink in. The officers left. The neighbors eventually went back inside. Michelle took the girls back into the house and spent an hour calming them down. Darnell didn't go inside. He sat on his front porch for a long time, looking at the street where he had just been handcuffed like a criminal. Then he made a phone call. He called his supervisor at the FBI field office in Cleveland. He explained what had happened. He explained that he had body camera footage, witness videos, and multiple neighbors who had observed the entire incident. And he explained that based on his professional experience, he believed this incident was not isolated, but indicative of a pattern. His supervisor's response was immediate. She told Darnell to document everything and come into the office first thing Monday morning. She said she would be making some calls of her own. By Monday afternoon, the FBI had opened a formal civil rights investigation into the Oakwood Hills Police Department. Have you ever seen karma move this fast? Drop a comment. The investigation moved with unusual speed, partly because the initial evidence was so overwhelming and partly because the victim was uniquely positioned to guide it. FBI agents obtained Mercer's body camera footage through a federal subpoena. They collected the videos recorded by Michelle, by Patricia Holloway, and by 2 other neighbors. They pulled Mercer's complete personnel file. They pulled personnel files for every officer in the department. They began interviewing citizens who had filed complaints over the past decade. What they found was not just one bad officer. What they found was an entire department rotted from the inside. Officer Kevin Mercer had 11 complaints in his file over 7 years. 9 of them involved stops of Black or Hispanic individuals in majority white neighborhoods. The complaints described a consistent pattern: stops without cause, aggressive questioning, demands for identification from people who were simply existing while not white. The department had sustained 0 of these complaints. Mercer had never faced any discipline beyond verbal counseling. But Mercer was not alone. The investigation revealed that the Oakwood Hills Police Department had received 147 citizen complaints over the past decade. 112 of them, more than 76%, involved interactions with Black or Hispanic citizens, even though those groups made up less than 8% of the town's population. The department had sustained 3 of those 147 complaints. 3, a rate so low it could only be explained by deliberate institutional protection of officers at the expense of citizens. The FBI interviewed former officers who had left the department. 3 of them described a toxic culture where racial profiling was not just tolerated, but actively encouraged. One described being told by a supervisor that his job was to make sure certain people understood they weren't welcome in Oakwood Hills. Another described being ostracized after he refused to participate in pretextual stops targeting Black drivers. The FBI interviewed citizens, dozens of them, Black families who had been stopped while visiting friends, Hispanic contractors who had been questioned while working on job sites, a Black doctor who had been pulled over 3 times in 1 month while driving to see patients, a Black teenager who had been handcuffed on his own lawn because he matched a description that turned out to not exist. The stories were horrifyingly consistent, and they painted a picture of a police department that had operated as an instrument of racial exclusion for years. The investigation expanded. The FBI subpoenaed emails, text messages, and internal communications. What they found was damning. Officers joking about keeping the neighborhood clean. Supervisors dismissing complaints without investigation. The police chief himself writing in an email that aggressive enforcement in transitional areas was essential to maintaining property values. The evidence was overwhelming, the pattern was undeniable, and the federal government was about to bring the hammer down. Type justice in the comments if you think this department deserved what was coming. 6 months after the incident on Darnell Crawford's lawn, the United States Department of Justice announced a federal civil rights lawsuit against the village of Oakwood Hills and its police department. The lawsuit alleged systematic racial discrimination, pattern and practice violations of constitutional rights, and deliberate indifference to citizen complaints. The lawsuit sought a consent decree that would place the department under federal oversight. It sought mandatory reforms to training, hiring, supervision, and discipline. It sought an independent monitor who would oversee compliance for years, and it sought damages for the dozens of citizens whose rights had been violated. But the federal lawsuit was just the beginning. The state of Ohio opened its own investigation. The Attorney General's office had been watching the federal case develop, and they decided to pile on. They announced a pattern and practice investigation focused on civil rights violations, unlawful searches, and false arrests. The state investigation uncovered even more evidence of misconduct. Officers had been filing false reports to justify pretextual stops. Supervisors had been coaching officers on how to articulate reasonable suspicion that didn't actually exist. The department had been systematically destroying complaint files to avoid accountability. The findings were released in a 200-page report that made national news. The report concluded that the Oakwood Hills Police Department had operated as an instrument of racial discrimination for at least a decade. It recommended dissolution. The village of Oakwood Hills faced an impossible choice. They could fight the federal and state lawsuits, spending millions in legal fees while the evidence against them became more damaging by the day. Or they could surrender. They surrendered. 18 months after Darnell Crawford was handcuffed on his own lawn, the village of Oakwood Hills announced that it was dissolving its police department entirely. Law enforcement services would be transferred to the county sheriff's office under a new contract that included strict oversight provisions and mandatory civil rights training. The Oakwood Hills Police Department ceased to exist. Every officer was terminated, every supervisor was fired. The police chief, who had overseen a decade of discrimination, was forced into early retirement with his pension under review. An entire department erased from existence because one officer couldn't accept that a black man might legitimately live in a nice house in a nice neighborhood. Officer Kevin Mercer faced criminal charges. The local prosecutor, under intense public pressure, charged him with assault, false imprisonment, and filing a false police report. A jury found him guilty on all counts. He was sentenced to 18 months in state prison, 3 years probation, and permanently banned from working in law enforcement in Ohio. But the state case was just the appetizer. The federal case was the main course. The United States Attorney's Office charged Mercer with deprivation of rights under color of law. The trial lasted 6 days. The body camera footage was played for the jury. The neighbor videos were shown. Darnell testified for 4 hours, walking the jury through every moment of the encounter and explaining exactly which constitutional rights had been violated and how. The jury deliberated for 2 hours. Guilty. The federal judge sentenced Kevin Mercer to an additional 4 years in federal prison to be served after his state sentence. He would spend more than 5 years behind bars for a 15-minute encounter on a quiet suburban street. Do you think the sentence was fair? Let me know in the comments. The civil lawsuits produced the largest settlements in the village's history. Darnell Crawford sued and settled for $4.2 million. 37 other victims, citizens who had been stopped and searched and harassed over the years, filed their own lawsuits. The total settlements exceeded $11 million. The village's insurance rates skyrocketed. Property taxes had to be raised to cover the costs. The taxpayers of Oakwood Hills paid the price for a decade of discrimination. They paid for every false stop, every ignored complaint, every officer who had been protected instead of disciplined. They paid with their tax dollars, and they paid with the destruction of their police department. Darnell donated a significant portion of his settlement to civil rights organizations and legal defense funds for victims of police misconduct. He established a scholarship fund for students pursuing careers in law enforcement reform. He continued his work with the FBI, now with an even deeper personal understanding of the issues he investigated. He still lives in Oakwood Hills. He still parks his Charger in front of his house. His daughters, now 10 and 13, no longer cry when they see police cars, though they remain wary. His wife still practices corporate law, though she now does significant pro bono work for civil rights organizations. Patricia Holloway, the neighbor who recorded the incident, became a local activist. She organized community meetings about police reform. She testified before the state legislature about what she witnessed. She is 71 years old, and she attends every village council meeting to make sure the new sheriff's contract is being properly enforced. The other neighbors who recorded that day became witnesses in multiple lawsuits. Their videos were shown in courts and training sessions across the country. They proved that bystander recording isn't just a right, but a responsibility. The case is now taught in law schools, police academies, and FBI training programs. It is cited as an example of systemic police misconduct, of institutional failure to address complaints, and of what happens when a department protects its officers at the expense of the citizens they're supposed to serve. It is also cited as an example of accountability, of what happens when victims have the knowledge, the resources, and the determination to fight back, of what happens when the federal government takes civil rights violations seriously. An entire police department was dissolved. Dozens of officers lost their jobs. One officer went to prison. Millions of dollars were paid in settlements, all because one cop couldn't accept that a black man in a polo shirt might actually live in a nice neighborhood. And Kevin Mercer? He is currently serving year 3 of his combined state and federal sentences. When he is released, he will be a convicted felon. He will never work in law enforcement again. He will carry that body camera footage with him for the rest of his life, a permanent record of the moment he destroyed everything. He had 7 years on the force. He threw it all away in 15 minutes because he saw a black man next to a nice car in a nice neighborhood and decided that man didn't belong there. Some lessons come with a price tag. His was an entire police department. If you've made it to the end of this story, you understand why it matters. Please subscribe if you haven't already and share this video so others can see what accountability looks like when it actually happens. What was the most shocking part of this story for you? Let me know in the comments below.